Hello everyone. Before we start, hit that like button and subscribe. Drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is for you. That's how YouTube keeps sending you stories like this. And now, let's get into it. When I think back to those summers, I always picture the same things first. The packed dirt roads of the state park, the smell of pine needles warming in the afternoon sun, the steady hum of insects that never seemed to stop, and that restless excitement that came as the daylight faded and the campground grew quiet. I was around 14 or 15 then, still young enough to follow simple routines without questioning why they mattered so much, old enough to crave a little fear as long as it felt controlled. My family camped there almost every summer, and my friend and I always treated the dark woods like they were ours. Every night we slipped from our campsite as soon as the adults settled into their usual rhythm of soft talk and crackling campfire. We always called our nightly walk the ritual, even though it wasn't really anything planned or ceremonial. It just became something we never skipped. We walked the same general path through the woods, moving between the silhouettes of trees, checking how far we could go before we felt something push us to turn back. Most nights we stayed close to the campground since the woods were thick and easy to get confused in even with flashlights. But that one night, we decided to go deeper. I don't remember if it was boredom or the cool air, or just the feeling of wanting to test our nerve, but we went farther than we ever planned before the walk even started. The flashlights we carried were more like safety nets than tools, because we never kept them on unless we absolutely had to. We liked challenging ourselves by navigating without them, letting our eyes adjust to the dim shapes of the forest, relying on touch and sound. There was something strangely calming about hearing only our steady footsteps on the leaves, our breathing, and the distant rustles of small animals. The quiet of the forest at night was different from daytime quiet. It felt denser, heavier, as if the trees swallowed sound instead of carrying it. The trail, if it could even be called that, was nothing more than packed dirt and patches of grass flattened by other hikers or animals. It wound between tall trees that blocked out most of the sky. Only tiny pieces of moonlight slipped through the canopy. By the time we were half a mile from the nearest campsite, the air felt cooler. The ground dipped slightly, and the smell changed in a way that always meant we had gone deeper than usual. There was more damp earth, more old leaves breaking down, more stagnant water somewhere nearby. We kept walking, barely speaking, both of us listening to the soft crunch of our footsteps. It felt like we were balanced between thrill and unease, a place we enjoyed being in back then. The woods were familiar, but in the dark they felt like a completely different world. Then we heard it. A soft whispering behind us. Not loud, not clear, just enough to cut through the silence in a way that didn't match the natural sounds of the forest. We both froze. The whisper wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It sounded human. Quiet, broken, but definitely human. Without thinking, we clicked our flashlights on and spun around so fast my shoes slid a little on the dirt. The yellow beams cut between the trees, lighting the undergrowth and the uneven bark of trunks nearby. Nothing moved. Nothing looked out of place. The forest behind us looked exactly as it always did at night. Dark, empty, and still. We tried to brush it off, telling ourselves with our silence that it must have been some branch shifting or some trick of darkness playing with our nerves. The path looked normal, the bushes looked untouched, and there was no sound now at all except distant insects. So we kept going. But this time we walked slower. The dark around us seemed to grow thicker, like the trees were crowding in closer than before. I became more aware of each breath inside my chest and each step under my shoes. A few minutes later, we heard the whispering again. It was closer this time, still soft but more clear. The sound carried a strange rhythm, like someone mumbling without control of their words, just pushing air through their throat. We stopped walking. Neither of us turned immediately. It was as if our bodies needed a second to decide whether to face whatever was behind us. When we finally lifted our flashlights, the beams shook slightly with our breathing. We scanned the dark. The whispering stopped at the same moment our lights swept across the area. The woods looked empty again. Something felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain. Not supernatural, not anything like that. just wrong in the way that your instincts suddenly tell you you've gone too far. Stayed too long, pushed your luck. We didn't need to talk or plan anything. We simply knew it was time to head back. We turned around and began walking the direction we came from, our lights staying on now. The darkness felt thicker behind the trees, and every step made the woods feel unfamiliar even though we'd walked them hundreds of times. Then we saw her. She appeared on the ground just off to the side of the narrow path, moving in a way that didn't match anything we expected to see in the woods that late at night. She was crawling, dragging her body across the dirt, her hands pushing weakly against the ground. Her clothes were dark and smeared with soil, her hair hung in messy strands, and she kept whispering random words that didn't form any sentences. Her voice was shaky and low, like she didn't have full control of it. In our flashlight beams, she looked like a shadow at first, then slowly came into focus as an actual person, not something imagined. The moment she realized we could see her, she pushed herself unsteadily to her feet. Her posture was slouched, almost like her legs weren't working right. She looked exhausted, confused, and completely out of place in the middle of the woods. She wasn't threatening, but she definitely wasn't acting normal. She gestured in a clumsy, loose way, pointing vaguely around her as if she were trying to get her bearings or remember where she was supposed to be. It was clear almost immediately that she wasn't dangerous. She just looked lost in a way that felt heavy and unsettling. Her dirt-covered clothes, her unstable footing, and the strange whispering all made sense once we realized something was wrong with her in a simple, human way. No mystery, no shadows hiding something unnatural. Just a person who had wandered too far and fallen into the woods while not fully in control of herself. We guided her back toward the campground using our lights, walking slowly to keep her steady. The closer we got to the campsites, the more grounded everything felt. The familiar shapes of tents, the glow of lanterns, and even the quiet sounds of people settling in made everything feel less eerie. Her friends were sitting at their site, completely unaware anything had happened. When we brought her to them, they reacted with casual surprise, clearly not realizing she had been missing for so long, or that she had gotten lost so deep in the woods. Once she was reunited with her group, the tension that had built in my chest finally began to fade. The fear I'd felt wasn't from something supernatural or unexplainable. It came from knowing how wrong things could go in the dark when a person wandered off alone. If we hadn't walked that far into the woods for our little ritual, she might have stayed lost until morning. She could have kept crawling, whispering to no one, slowly getting colder and more disoriented. When we finally returned to our own campsite, the woods felt different in my mind. I realized that the darkness didn't need anything mysterious in it to be frightening. The real danger came from how easy it was to lose direction, how quickly confusion could turn into panic, and how people sometimes ended up in places they never intended to be simply because one wrong turn in the dark was all it took. That night changed our ritual. We still walked through the woods, but we never went as deep again. The memory of that woman crawling in the dirt, whispering random words into the night, stayed with me. Not because it was supernatural, but because it was real. That kind of fear sticks with you longer than anything imagined, and it reminded me how thin the line can be between a fun scare and a real one. I went camping at Ginny Springs in Florida about 10 years ago, back when I was a little more careless and didn't think too much about the things that could go wrong in a place like that. I had gone with a few people I knew, but we all camped in our own little spots, spaced far enough apart that everyone got some privacy. It was warm and humid the way Florida always feels at night, with that heavy air that sticks to your skin no matter how many times you wipe your face. I remember the smell of river water drifting through the trees, and that deep quiet that settles over a campsite once everyone finally stops talking and the fire burns into low orange pieces. My tent was set up on a patch of dirt that felt soft on top and firm underneath, just a few yards from a cluster of taller trees. I had walked around earlier in the day and noticed how many huge oaks stood around the area. Some looked strong and alive, others looked older, with dark patches near the roots like the ground had shifted around them over the years. I didn't think anything of it. Back then I never thought about the weight of a tree or what it would do if it suddenly let go. That night I lay inside my tent listening to the small sounds of the woods. The buzz of insects, the soft movement of leaves when the air pushed through the branches, the steady tap of something dropping from a tree, probably acorns or dry pieces of bark. I remember shifting around on my sleeping bag because it was already too warm inside the tent, and I had unzipped one side of the flap to let a little air in. It must have been sometime well past midnight when the whole ground seemed to jump. It wasn't just a noise at first, it felt like the soil under me shook. Then that sound came, the kind you hear in movies when a tree falls, that long cracking groan that rises into a sharp snap before crashing into the earth. It echoed through the dark so loudly that it stunned me for a second. I remember lying still, waiting for more, thinking maybe it was far away. Big forests make strange echoes. Things often sound closer than they are. At first I didn't react. I told myself it was normal, that trees fall all the time in old forests, especially after storms or during hot weather. It wasn't windy that night, but I pushed that out of my mind. I tried to settle back into the position I was in before the noise happened, and I tried to breathe slower, but I could feel my heart picking up a little. My ears stayed alert, waiting for anything else. For almost 10 minutes nothing happened. Everything went back to that still quiet except for the insects. I stared up at the nylon of my tent, barely able to see the shape of the ceiling in the darkness. Then I heard something else. Not footsteps, at least not at first. It sounded like soft, uneven movement in the distance. Then more of it. Then voices, several of them. They blended together like the sound of a crowd after a game, all layered and overlapping but too far or too jumbled to understand. The tone was off. Not the relaxed sound people make when they're drinking at a campsite. More like a panicked mix of fear and confusion. I pushed myself up and unzipped the tent flap. The second I stepped outside, the coolness of the night felt different. It was still humid, but the air carried that sharp smell of fresh splintered wood. There were beams of flashlights cutting through the dark, moving fast in all different directions. People were clustered around an area not too far from where I was camped, maybe just a short walk through a thin line of trees. At first I couldn't see what they were surrounding. It wasn't until I walked closer that I noticed how uneven the ground looked. A huge tree, an oak that must have been at least several feet across, lay on its side, its roots ripped out of the ground like a giant claw. It had fallen across a campsite. A tent was underneath it, completely flattened, almost invisible under the thick trunk. I stood still because I didn't know what to do. I didn't know if stepping closer would get in the way. The people around the fallen tree weren't shouting, but their voices carried that sharp edge of panic that you feel in your chest even if you're not involved. The beam of someone's flashlight passed over the exposed core of the tree, showing the inside had been hollowed out, almost rotted. It looked strong on the outside but had been waiting to collapse. The weight of the whole trunk had come down exactly where someone had been sleeping. There was no movement under the crushed tent. A few people kept trying to lift parts of the trunk or move debris, but the tree was too big. You could see it in their faces when they stepped back. This wasn't something anyone could fix with bare hands. More lights showed up. People from other campsites, strangers half-dressed, still wiping sleep out of their eyes as they realized how close they had been to the same thing happening. You could feel the fear start to spread through the air, a kind of silence that hovered between the movement and the whispers. Everyone understood what they were looking at, even if no one said it out loud. Time felt strange then. Everything moved slowly and quickly at the same time. I stood there watching from a few steps back while people tried to figure out how to help. Someone must have run to alert the staff. After a while I heard the low thudding vibration of something coming closer from above. A helicopter. It circled once before lowering toward a clearing. The blades sent loose dirt and leaves flying in every direction. More people showed up with stretchers and equipment. Bright beams lit up the area until everything around the fallen tree was exposed. When they finally lifted the pieces enough to get to the person inside, the reality settled over everyone. Even from where I stood, I could feel the shift in the mood around the scene. It was the kind of heaviness that sinks into your stomach. The paramedics worked with practiced speed, but there was no urgency in their movements anymore. Only procedure. Precision. The kind they use when they know the outcome isn't going to change. they prepared the body to be airlifted out. The helicopter's lights washed over the broken tree, the torn tent, and the stunned faces of everyone standing nearby. When they lifted the stretcher, the campsite went completely silent. No one moved until the helicopter rose back into the sky and disappeared into the dark. Only after the sound faded did people start to drift away, each person quiet, each one carrying that uneasy realization about how fragile things are when you sleep under the trees. I walked back to my tent with a strange weight pressing on my chest. When I crawled inside, I didn't lie down. I just sat there thinking about how close it had been. The tree that fell wasn't far from mine. I thought about all the times I had camped without ever looking up at what hung above me, without thinking about the way the ground shifts or how a tree can rot from the inside out without showing anything obvious on the surface. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Every sound made me tense. Every crack from the woods made me imagine another tree giving out. When the sun finally came up, the campsite felt different. It wasn't the place I had arrived at the day before. People packed their gear quietly, avoiding eye contact. The spot where the tree had fallen was roped off, and the huge trunk lay across it like a warning carved into the earth. When I left Ginny Springs that morning, I kept thinking about how quickly everything had happened. One moment it was just a normal night in the woods, the kind I had experienced dozens of times. The next moment someone's life had ended only a short distance away from where I was sleeping. That thought stayed with me. It made me understand something I hadn't understood before. Camping isn't just peaceful scenery and quiet nights. It's also real risk, real weight above your head, real consequences hidden in places you don't look at twice. It taught me to pay attention, to check the trees, to think about the things most people ignore when they set up their tents. That trip changed the way I camp. It changed the way I think about the outdoors. And even now, years later, whenever I'm trying to fall asleep in a tent and I hear the soft creaking of branches overhead, I still remember that night at Ginny Springs. The sound of the tree falling, the voices rising in the dark, and the sight of the helicopter lifting into the sky with someone who never expected their last night to come like that. I always looked forward to those birthdays more than anything else in my life back then. My ex and I shared the same birthday, and for a few years Ginny Springs became our tradition. We would pack the car the night before, usually way too much stuff, because we never really learned how to pack light. And we would make the long, slow drive out there with the same excitement every year. The place always felt like a break from everything else. Clear water, long dirt paths, the mix of heat and shade from all the trees, the smell of the river that hangs in the air, even when you are not right beside it. I never thought I would remember one night there more than the others, but the night with the scream stuck with me in a way I never expected. We always picked the same kind of spot. Not too close to the crowds, not too deep in the dark woods either. Just somewhere a little off the main path so we could have our own space at night. It always felt safer that way. On that trip, we got there late in the afternoon. The place was busy, but not loud yet. The sun was dropping behind the trees, giving that orange glow that always makes the river look deeper than it is. I remember feeling tired from carrying all the gear but still relaxed, like I had nothing else to do for the rest of the day except breathe. We set up the tent under trees that leaned in slightly as if they were forming a cover. The ground there was layered with dry leaves and patches of sand. The tent floor always had that slight uneven feel, with roots under it that you just had to get used to. We set the cooler next to the fire ring, put our chairs in a spot where we could see the river through the trees, and then let the evening settle. The air cooled fast, the insects came out, and the place took on that nighttime silence that is never fully silent. There are always little sounds out there. Snapping twigs, rustling leaves, distant footsteps from other campers you can't see, the slow-moving river. I used to enjoy that part. It made me feel like I was far from anything stressful. Later that night, we crawled into the tent. The nylon walls around us always amplified small sounds from outside, especially when everything else went still. The smell inside the tent was always the same mix of plastic, dirt, and whatever lotion or sunscreen we had used earlier. The temperature dropped more than I expected. I pulled my sleeping bag up to my chin and listened to the night. I felt comfortable for a long time, just lying there in the dark with only the mesh ceiling above me and the faint glow from some distant campsite fire coming through the trees. At some point the night got quiet enough that I could hear the soft shifting of the river again. I had just started drifting into that half-sleep where your thoughts drift around loosely when the scream cut through everything. It was so sharp and sudden that it almost felt like something snapped inside my chest. It didn't sound like a person. It had that raw, tearing quality that you only hear from animals. It echoed from somewhere close enough to make the ground feel smaller. For a second I thought something was right beside the tent. Before I could even process it, another sound followed, this low, deep growling. Not the kind you hear from a small animal. It was rough, heavy, and came in short bursts like something was pushing air hard through its throat. I froze completely. My whole body felt tight. My breathing went shallow without me noticing. All I could think about was how thin the tent walls were. A piece of fabric was the only thing between me and whatever was happening out there. My mind immediately jumped to mountain lions because I knew Florida had them, even if they were rare. The combination of that scream and that growl made it feel like two big animals were out there tearing into each other. I lay completely still. I didn't move a finger. Every time the growling rose, I could feel a vibration in the air around me, almost like the sound was passing straight through the tent. I tried to listen for paw steps or movement, but all I heard were short bursts of leaves being pushed around, followed by more growls and then another high, sharp scream. The tent felt too small, like the walls were pressing in. My mind kept picturing a large animal slamming into the side of the tent by accident. I kept waiting for claws or weight or something hitting the wall. The noise kept going. Not constant, but steady enough to make my nerves feel pulled tight. I remember feeling a heat in my chest that came from fear, not from the temperature. My hands were sweating even though the air was cool. I could feel my ex lying stiff beside me, both of us too scared to move. I didn't want to breathe too loudly, afraid that any small sound might catch the attention of whatever was outside. After a while, I realized the sounds weren't moving much. They were staying in one general spot, maybe 20 or 30 feet from the tent. It was hard to tell in the dark. Everything feels closer at night. I strained my ears trying to figure out whether the animals were getting aggressive or if it was just some sort of standoff. There were pauses between each sound, which made it worse somehow. The silence felt loaded, like something was about to happen. Eventually, after what felt like a long stretch of time, I felt a small burst of adrenaline build in me. It wasn't courage really, just the need to know what was out there. I slowly pushed my hands against the tent floor and sat up as quietly as possible. The nylon made a faint rustle. My heart jumped each time it happened. When I finally got all the way up, I lifted my eyes toward the mesh ceiling. The top of the tent was dark, but I could see shapes moving beyond the mesh, silhouettes shifting against the faint glow from a nearby campsite. At first I couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. There were two small shapes low to the ground. One shape was narrow and tense, moving in short jerks. The other was a low, rounded shape that barely moved at all. I blinked a few times, thinking my eyes were adjusting poorly. Then the narrow shape arched its back, and I saw the outline of a tail puffed out larger than its body. The scream earlier made sense all of a sudden. It was a cat, a house cat of all things. Not a big wild cat. Just a stray that must have been living around the campsites. The growling wasn't deep and heavy like I imagined. It was just that small animal kind of growling that sounds rough in the dark but harmless in daylight. The rounded shape wasn't another predator. It was an armadillo. It stood there, stiff and completely unbothered, probably frozen in that defensive instinct they have. The cat circled it, tense and dramatic, acting far tougher than it really was. The armadillo didn't even lift a foot. The fear drained out of me so quickly that I felt almost lightheaded. Everything that had felt huge and dangerous a moment earlier now looked almost silly. The scream had been that odd. High-pitched cry cats make when they feel threatened. The kind that always sounds way bigger than the animal. The growling was just the same thing, but closer to the tent than it should have been. The way the sound bounced through the trees must have made it feel much deeper. My chest finally loosened. My breathing went back to a normal rhythm. I slowly lowered myself back down to the sleeping bag. feeling a mix of embarrassment and relief. The fear had been real, though. The way it had grabbed hold of me in that dark tent was something I'll never forget. After a few more minutes, the noise faded. The cat must have gotten bored or realized the armadillo wasn't going to do anything, and wandered off. The armadillo stayed still for a long time before eventually shuffling away on its slow little legs. Once everything went quiet again, the night returned to its usual rhythm. Crickets, distant water, the soft breeze brushing against the tent walls. I didn't sleep right away. I lay awake thinking about how differently things feel at night when you can't see what's happening. A small animal becomes a threat. A stray sound becomes something dangerous. The dark space outside the thin fabric becomes its own world where your mind fills in all the worst shapes. It reminded me how fragile camping feels sometimes. How much trust you put in the idea that nothing bad will walk too close. By the time morning light started to seep through the tent, I felt calmer. When I stepped outside, I could see the patch of leaves where the cat and the armadillo had stood their ground. It looked ordinary. Nothing dramatic at all. Just a small disturbed area of dirt and a couple of fresh tracks. It almost made me laugh how terrified I had been, but the fear had been real in the moment, and I didn't try to pretend it wasn't. That morning I realized something simple but important. Most of the fear I felt in places like that came from not knowing, not seeing, not understanding what was right outside the thin wall of the tent. The moment I could see the truth, the fear vanished. It made me think about how many things in life feel the same way, how much larger problems look when you haven't seen them clearly yet. The memory of that night stayed with me long after the birthdays and the trips ended. Not because anything horrible happened, but because of how real the fear felt and how quickly it turned into something almost ordinary once I understood it. It taught me something about myself, something about fear, and something about how the mind works when it's wrapped in darkness and waiting for something unknown to pass. In the end, it wasn't a mountain lion, it wasn't a violent fight, and it wasn't anything dangerous at all. It was just a stray cat and an armadillo staring each other down in the dark woods of Ginny Springs, making sounds that felt far bigger than they were. The night that started with panic ended with nothing more than a reminder of how easily the mind can turn small things into monsters, when all you have between you and the wild is a thin sheet of fabric and a few hours of darkness. I got into the valley late that evening, later than I meant to, because I stayed too long on a ridge trail that overlooked the river. It had been one of those days where the sun felt closer than usual and the air held on to every bit of heat. By the time I realized how fast the light was dropping behind the tree line, I was already committed to a long walk back. The trail thinned into a patchy line of dirt and roots, and the shadows came faster than I expected. When I finally reached the lower switchbacks and stepped onto the gravel near the road, I was sweating and breathing harder than I wanted to admit. There was a guy there near the bend, a local-looking man around my age. He seemed relaxed, the type of person who knew the land well. He pointed out a hidden camping pullout near the river, a spot he said people didn't notice because the brush camouflaged the entry. It sounded good enough, and I was too tired to search for anything else. This valley had no cell service, and the stretch of road felt completely silent except for the river. I followed his directions and found the little opening. From the road, it was invisible, just another wall of green. But pushing past the brush revealed a small area shaped like a shallow bowl in the earth, close to the water, but tucked just enough that headlights wouldn't catch it. I parked my truck under the trees and set up a small fire with the leftover daylight. The flames felt good after the long, hot hike, even though the air still carried some of that heat. I cracked a beer and put on my friend's comedy podcast because the valley felt too quiet. That heavy kind of silence that echoes in your ears. The firelight bounced off the truck's metal surfaces and the surrounding trees. I knew I was loud and visible. I didn't feel worried at the time because the place seemed peaceful, the river low and steady. I had my tent in the truck bed, but by then it was fully dark, and I didn't feel like setting it up. Laziness made the decision for me. I spread my sleeping bag inside the back of the truck under the topper, surrounded by all my gear. It wasn't the most comfortable thing in the world, but it felt safe enough to fall asleep to the sound of water and muffled laughter from the podcast. The night passed without anything strange, at least anything I noticed. I woke a few times because the topper trapped heat and made the air thick, but every time I peeked out, the valley looked empty. Just the faint glow of the dying fire and the dark line of the river. By morning the air felt cooler and cleaner, the kind of morning that makes the trees look sharper and the river sound louder. I climbed out of the truck, stretched my stiff back, kicked the fire back to life, and cracked another beer to go with breakfast. The smell of the pan heating up mixed with the earthy scent of damp soil. The birds were loud in the brush and the light came down through the trees in long white lines. It felt like a perfect morning to be isolated, even without any cell signal. I was tending to the pan when I noticed a shape at the edge of the trees. At first I thought it was a stump or maybe a shadow, but it didn't fit the shape of anything natural. Then it moved in a slow, dragging way, like someone easing forward after standing in one place for too long. When he stepped out fully into view, the whole scene shifted from peaceful to wrong within seconds. He looked filthy, like someone who had been living out there for a long time. His beard was long and matted, the kind that traps leaves and pieces of dirt. His clothes were barely visible under the dozens of plastic grocery bags tied all over his body. They rustled faintly with each small movement. I had seen eccentric people before, drifters, wanderers, but something about him felt off. He didn't look up at me or make any expression. He wasn't even looking toward me directly. His eyes seemed aimed at the ground or the trees behind me, like I wasn't the person standing in the middle of the camp. He moved closer in uneven steps, stopping every few feet and shifting direction slightly. I could feel the back of my shirt sticking to me from the sudden spike of adrenaline. I said something about how nice the day was, a soft comment just to break the tension, but he didn't react. Not even a twitch toward my voice. I tried to offer him breakfast, turning the pan slightly as if that would catch his attention. Nothing. The river and the fire sounded louder because he remained silent. He circled the loose edge of my camp like he was following an invisible line only he could see. His pace wasn't quick, but it was unsettling. Each time he drifted a few feet one way, he doubled back, then turned his back to me completely, and stood there for several seconds as if waiting for something. Every instinct in me was telling me something wasn't right. The way he avoided eye contact, the bags tied everywhere, the way he kept his back turned and just stood there. I offered him a beer, holding it up in plain view. Again, nothing. It was like I wasn't even a real person to him. The whole situation felt like the air had thickened and time slowed down around us. I kept glancing at my truck, thinking about my gear, thinking about the bear spray I kept close. I didn't want him to step closer, not even 1 foot closer. He finally stopped pacing and stood still near the trees with his back facing me. The plastic bags on him shifted slightly with the breeze, making soft crackling sounds that layered with the hiss of my breakfast pan. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I realized I didn't have any way to call for help if things went bad. No phone service, no nearby campers, no one who would hear anything. I had only what I brought, and this strange man was inside my space without saying a word. I felt the panic rising, the kind that starts in the legs and stomach. I gave him the ultimatum, telling him he either had to acknowledge me or leave immediately. When he didn't react at all, didn't even flinch, something inside me broke through the fear and pushed forward. I reached for my bear spray, gripping it tight, took a few steps toward him so he could see I wasn't helpless. Only then did he move. He didn't look back, didn't run, didn't say anything. He just soaked away in a slow, dragging walk, slipping between the trees until the bags became nothing but faint sounds in the brush. As soon as he disappeared, I started throwing everything I could grab into the truck. I didn't care if anything got damaged or dirty. I just wanted out. My hands were shaking and my breathing felt short and shallow. The fire was still going, the pan still warm, but I didn't care. I slammed the tailgate shut, climbed into the driver's seat, and pulled out of that hidden spot as fast as the narrow path allowed. Driving back up the road, I kept checking the mirrors, half expecting to see the bags or his shape standing somewhere along the shoulder, but the valley stayed empty behind me. When I reached the main road, I didn't slow down. I drove until the mountains thinned out and my phone finally buzzed with signal again. Only then did some of the shaking fade. The more I replayed the morning in my head, the more a cold thought kept pressing itself into me. That spot was hidden from the road. Anyone could have walked by in the night without me knowing. I had been loud, visible, distracted, and half drunk by the fire. The truck bed had been the only barrier I had. If I had set up the tent in the dark like I'd originally planned, I would have been on the ground, with only a thin sheet of fabric between me and whatever that man was doing in the valley that night. Whether he saw me earlier or watched from the dark or was simply passing through, I will never know. But the possibility hung heavy in my mind. I still camp, but I never camp that blindly again. I learned that morning how quickly a quiet valley can turn into a place where instincts matter more than comfort. The ending was simple but sharp. Nothing happened. But something almost did. Leaving when I did probably saved me from finding out the rest. I became grateful for my laziness, because sleeping in the truck instead of a tent might have been the only smart thing I did that night. I went camping with my friends back in high school during a long weekend when none of us had anything better to do. We planned a hike far out into the woods and into the low mountains near the state line. It was one of those plans you make at that age where none of you really think it through. We stuffed our backpacks with cheap tents, cheap food, and even cheaper flashlights. We left before sunrise, full of energy and stupid confidence, thinking we were going to have some big adventure that felt like freedom. By the time we reached the ridge where we wanted to camp, the excitement had burned off, and all that was left was fatigue. The trail had been steeper than we expected, climbing through loose rock and pine needles that slid under our feet. The air got hotter the higher we climbed, and every step felt like a fight against gravity. I remember the sweat running into my eyes, the straps of my pack digging into my shoulders, and the way every breath felt too warm. By the time we found a patch of level ground near a cluster of tall pines, none of us cared about the view or the silence or anything else. We just dropped our packs, set up our tents in clumsy, uneven shapes, and crawled inside as soon as the last corner was staked. My whole body felt like it was humming from exhaustion. The forest was quiet in that way deep woods get, not silent exactly, but steady. A sort of background hum of insects, leaves, and distant water somewhere we couldn't see. We ate whatever snacks we had left energy for, then practically passed out the moment we lay down. I remember the air cooling fast, the smell of pine, pitch, and dirt drifting into the tent through the mesh, and the way my limbs felt too heavy to move. I didn't even bother pulling on extra layers, even though the night was dropping colder by the minute. I just sank into my sleeping bag and let the darkness swallow me. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up for no clear reason. The kind of waking that feels like someone pulling you out of a dream by the shoulders. I lay still at first, trying to figure out what had changed. The forest didn't sound the same. The background hum was gone. No insects, no wind through branches, no rustling. Just a deep, heavy stillness like the whole place was holding its breath. I felt that old instinctive discomfort crawl up my spine, the feeling that something is wrong even if you can't explain why. Then I heard the first sound outside the tent. It was soft, but close. A single step, like something pressing down into leaves and dirt. It didn't sound like a branch falling or a pine cone dropping. It sounded intentional. I stared at the thin fabric wall of the tent and tried to keep my breathing steady. My friends were in their own tents a few feet away, but everything around me felt too quiet and too large and too empty. Another sound came from the other side of my tent. Another step. Then another, farther back. I couldn't place the direction. It felt like whatever was out there wasn't in one place but moving. Or several things were moving. The steps were spread out, not hurried, not clumsy, just slow and spaced in a way that didn't make sense to me. The kind of movement you hear when something is circling, not approaching. I felt the skin on my arms crawl even though my sleeping bag was up to my chest. My heart was hammering in my ears. I kept telling myself it was deer or maybe elk moving through. We had seen scat on the way up, but the steps were too steady, too measured. And what bothered me the most was the silence between them. No snorting, no shifting of weight, no brush of bodies against branches. Just footsteps on the forest floor. I reached slowly for my flashlight, The cheap plastic felt too loud in my hand even though it didn't make a sound. I hesitated, staring at the zipper of the tent. I didn't want to look. The darkness outside felt too thick, like shining light into it might show something I didn't want to see. But the footsteps kept coming, small clusters of sound, shuffling from different angles around the tent. My imagination started to work against me, filling in shapes I couldn't see. I finally unzipped the tent just enough to slip my hand through. The cold air hit my skin, sharp enough to wake me fully. I pushed the flap aside and aimed the flashlight out into the dark. The beam wavered for a second because my hand was shaking. At first, all I saw were trees. Tall, dark trunks rising like pillars, branches swaying just a little, but not enough to make sound. The flashlight beam reached farther than I expected, slicing through layers of darkness. I swept it slowly left to right, trying to convince myself I had imagined the sounds. For a moment, the clearing looked empty. Then the beam hit a pair of eyes. They reflected back at me with that flat, glassy shine that animals get at night. But they weren't low to the ground. They were at the height of a grown man standing straight. The flashlight beam jittered in my hand, and I tightened my grip on it. My stomach dropped. The eyes didn't blink. They didn't move. They just stared back. I tried to breathe quietly, but it felt like the cold air stuck in my throat. I kept sweeping the light, even though I didn't want to. A few feet from the first pair, another set of eyes appeared. Also high, also still. Then another and another. They were spread out in a rough circle around the tent, scattered among the trees, but close enough that their shapes were only just out of reach of the beam. It felt like the entire forest had eyes. I leaned forward a little, squinting to focus the light. I expected to see shapes, maybe a head, a shoulder, anything that would make sense of the height. But all I saw were shadows that swallowed the edges of the beam. The eyes stayed steady and silent, not flinching or shifting like deer usually did when hit with light. Their stillness made everything worse. It reminded me of people standing perfectly still in the dark, but I knew that didn't make any sense. We were miles from any trail, and no one hikes out there at night without gear or voices or light. I pulled the flashlight back for a moment to steady my breathing, and the darkness rushed in again, covering everything. The footsteps had stopped. There was no movement now, no sound except my heart thudding hard enough that I felt it in my ears. I realized my friends hadn't stirred. Either they hadn't woken up or they were lying perfectly still, just like me, too afraid to unzip their tents or move. I forced myself to look again, shining the beam quickly across the clearing. The eyes were still there, but farther back now, like whatever had been close had stepped just out of the range of the light. I felt a tightness in my chest, a sort of dizzy pressure, like the air itself had thickened. I ducked back inside my tent, zipped it shut, and held the flashlight against my chest like it could somehow protect me. I didn't hear any more footsteps, but the silence felt heavy, like something was waiting just beyond the thin walls. I lay there for hours, too afraid to move. I kept listening for breathing, for snapping twigs, for anything that would give me clues about what was out there. But the silence stayed unbroken. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me under again. My body couldn't keep up with the fear. When I woke up, sunlight was spilling into the tent through the mesh. It was late morning. The forest sounded normal again. Birds calling, insects buzzing, wind moving through branches. The ground outside was covered with frost, and the air was sharp enough to sting my lungs when I stepped outside. My friends were already up, looking groggy and confused. None of them mentioned hearing anything at night, and I didn't bring it up right away. I walked around the campsite, scanning the ground for tracks. The dirt was disturbed, but in a messy way that didn't make much sense. Some prints looked like deer, large and soft-edged. Some looked more like elk. A few were too blurred to identify. None were close to tent height. That didn't change what I had seen. As we packed up, I kept glancing into the trees, half expecting to see those eyes again watching from a distance. But the forest felt normal, almost friendly, like the night had been some strange pocket of time that didn't belong to the rest of the world. Later, when we made it back to town, I spent hours looking up animals in the area, trying to find something that matched the height and behavior. The only explanation that made sense, at least in a technical way, was that we had spooked a group of elk that had wandered into the clearing. Elk can stand tall enough that their eyes look man height. and they often freeze in place when confronted with light. But even that explanation didn't sit right with me. The eyes had seemed too still, too evenly spaced, and too silent. Elk usually make noise, even small sounds, but what I had heard was steps without any of the usual animal shuffle. Years later, when I look back on that night, the memory still feels sharp. Not like imagination, not like a dream, but like something raw and real. I know the forest holds its own logic, one that doesn't always line up with what we expect. I know animals behave unpredictably, especially at night, and I know fear can fill in gaps in ways that feel convincing. But what I remember the most is the stillness of those eyes. The height, the silence. The way they watched without moving, like they were waiting for something I couldn't understand. Maybe it was just elk. Maybe the darkness magnified everything. Maybe the silence made normal things feel unnatural. Or maybe the forest was reminding us how small we were out there, how little control we had, how easily the night can turn familiar ground into something that feels alive in a different way. I can't prove what I saw, but I remember it clearly, and I still feel that same cold weight in my stomach whenever I think about unzipping that tent and shining my light out into the dark, where shapes didn't move and eyes didn't blink. I never camped in that area again. I never forgot the feeling of being surrounded by something that didn't need to make noise to let me know it was there. And I never forgot how close those eyes were before they melted back into the night, leaving only silence and the thin wall of a tent between me and whatever stood just outside. I grew up thinking camping was just something every family did. It was built into the rhythm of our summers, as normal as heat waves and mosquito bites. We rotated between the same three places every year: Virginia Beach, Assateague, and Westmoreland. Virginia Beach always felt too crowded, Westmoreland felt too miserable, and Assateague always sat somewhere in the middle, beautiful in the daytime but unsettling once the sun dropped behind the dunes. My parents loved it though, and every time we headed there I knew exactly what we were in for. The thick humid air, the constant salt blowing in from the ocean, and the ponies. Everyone knew about the ponies. On this trip, the campground was busy, but not enough to feel cramped. We got a site close enough to hear the ocean, but far enough back that the dunes hid the water behind a hump of tall grass and sand. The place smelled like salt, seaweed, and damp wood. When we arrived, it was late afternoon and everything looked peaceful and harmless. Families dragging coolers, kids running barefoot through the sand, and the occasional pony wandering through like it owned the place. By evening, we had 2 tents set up. The larger one was for my parents and me, and the smaller one, a little farther off, was for my older relatives. I remember that evening more clearly than the ones before it. The sky had this faded pink haze stretching over the whole beach, and the wind kept shifting, bringing either hot sand or cool salty mist depending on which direction it swung. The campground slowly dimmed as people settled in for the night. You could hear laughter, zippers closing tents, the soft thud of footsteps on sand. But even with all of that, the island always felt bigger at night, like the emptiness beyond the dunes swallowed the small noises we made. I remember lying in the tent listening to the wind scraping across the nylon walls, and thinking about how none of us could see much beyond the shadows drifting around outside. When it finally got dark, it got dark fast. The moon was bright, but every shadow seemed deeper because of it. My dad fell asleep quickly, and my mom settled beside him. I laid there listening to the familiar mix of insects, waves, and distant voices fading one by one. Eventually I drifted off. What woke me wasn't a sound but a shift beside me. My mom sat up so fast and so stiff that the motion jolted me awake. The tent was still, the air a little colder than before. I blinked, trying to understand why she was sitting there without moving. Her back was straight and her head turned toward the front wall of the tent. I followed where she was looking, and at first I didn't understand what I was seeing. The moonlight coming through the thin fabric cast everything in pale blue. Right outside the tent door, pressed close enough that I could see the shape clearly, stood what looked exactly like an old woman. The outline of a head. Long, wary hair hanging down unevenly. A hunched shape leaning toward the mesh, as if staring directly in at us. The thin fabric blurred her features, but not the shape. The shape was enough. My whole body locked up. It felt like my lungs forgot how to work. I was small, and the idea of someone, especially someone that close. Staring into the tent in the middle of the night sent an immediate wave of fear through me. I didn't have any complex thoughts. I didn't try to make sense of it. I just knew someone, or something shaped like someone, was inches away from us in the dark. The longer I stared, the more the shape didn't move. Not even a shift. It just stood there. The hair looked tangled and thin. It lifted slightly in the breeze, giving the impression of something alive and watching. My mind scrambled for explanations, but nothing fit. No other campers had wandered close earlier. There was no reason for someone to be standing there silent, leaning into our tent like that. I didn't realize I had made a sound until the shape suddenly jerked away. It didn't turn like a person. It bolted sideways, away from the tent, in one sudden motion so fast that the whole silhouette warped and snapped out of view. Something thudded the ground outside, and the earth under the tent vibrated like a heavy animal had launched itself forward. That was the moment everything made sense at once. It wasn't a woman. It was one of the feral ponies. The outline that had looked like long, wary hair had just been the pony's mane blowing in the breeze. The hunched shape had been its body leaning against the tent as it tried to figure out what was inside. And the sudden burst of speed matched exactly what I had seen those ponies do during the day when they got startled and ran off. The moment the realization hit, a strange mix of relief and lingering fear washed over me. Relief that it wasn't a person staring at us, but fear because ponies weren't exactly harmless either. Their size alone could crush a person if they stepped wrong. And the more I thought about it, the more I understood why it had happened. We had set up our tent right in the middle of one of their paths. They moved through the campsites sometimes without caring who or what was in the way. They used the same trails every night, going from the inland grass areas out toward the beach. Our tent must have blocked part of that route. After the pony ran off, the campground became quiet again, but a different kind of quiet. Not the peaceful one from earlier. This one felt heavier, more alert. My mom stayed awake for a long time, and even though we didn't speak, I could sense her tension. My dad slept through the whole thing, which felt impossible in the moment but made sense later. He could sleep through almost anything. I lay there wide awake, replaying the sight in my head. How easily the shape had convinced me it was a person. How natural it had seemed that someone could be there, even though we were in the middle of a wildlife refuge at night. The thin fabric of the tent had distorted every detail enough to trick my young mind into thinking something impossible was happening. And the strange stillness of the pony had matched exactly what I imagined a person watching us would look like. Eventually I drifted off again, though I woke up several times before dawn, each time listening for hoofbeats or any soft brushing sound near the tent walls. When morning finally came, we stepped outside and saw the proof all around us. Tracks in the sand. Fresh marks right beside the entrance of the tent. A few strands of coarse hair caught in the brush near where the pony must have stood. The path was clear too, trampled grass and a narrow strip in the sand leading straight toward the dunes. We had camped directly over one of their regular routes without even noticing. That morning felt different. The campground looked the same, sunlit and busy with families cooking breakfast and kids running around, but the night lingered in my mind. Seeing the tracks felt like confirmation that something wild had passed within inches of where we slept. Not a person, not something malicious, but something heavy, unpredictable, and completely at home in a place we were only visiting. The clarity of the ending came from understanding what really happened. There hadn't been anyone staring into the tent. No intruder, no danger from another person. It was just the island behaving exactly as it always had, long before campgrounds and tourists showed up. The ponies moved where they wanted, when they wanted, and we had placed ourselves right in their way. As the years went on, that memory stayed with me, not because it was supernatural or dramatic, but because of how real it felt in the moment. The fear had been genuine, born from the shapes and shadows that the human mind tries to piece into something familiar when it doesn't have enough information. The relief came from learning the truth, but there was still something unsettling about knowing a large wild animal had been close enough to press its face against our tent without making a sound. Looking back, it taught me something important about camping and about places like Unsettling. The island wasn't dangerous in the way my imagination first believed. But it wasn't harmless either. It was real, wild, and indifferent to us. And that night, standing completely unaware just inches from the thin barrier that separated us, one of the ponies reminded me how small we were out there, and how easily the quiet shapes of the night could trick the mind into seeing something else entirely. The clarity of it all settled in only years later. Nothing paranormal happened that night. Nothing mysterious. Just a child, a tent, the moonlight, and a wild pony trying to follow a path it had used long before I ever set foot there. And even though the truth was simple, the fear I felt was real, and it stayed with me in a way that shaped how I viewed the night, the wild, and the thin line between imagination and reality ever since. I always thought I understood what counted as scary in the woods, but it took me a few trips to realize that fear comes in different shapes. Some of it is sudden, loud, violent. Some of it is quiet and strange and sits in your head long after you leave. And sometimes it's both at once, like the land itself is reminding you that you never really have control, no matter how well you plan or how many times you've camped before. The windstorm happened first, long before the stranger stuff, but it stuck with me. My wife and I had set up camp in a thick patch of jack pine. The ground was flat, soft, and smelled like warm sap. I remember thinking how peaceful it felt, how it was the kind of forest where you'd hear every sound through the night. I didn't expect the sound we ended up getting. The wind came out of nowhere, angry and wild, and it felt like the entire forest bent sideways. I could hear trees creaking and snapping around us. It wasn't just branches. Whole trees were ripping out of the ground and hitting the earth with these deep, heavy thuds that I felt in my chest. The tent shook so hard that I thought the poles would fold in. All I could do was sit there, listening to everything smashing down around us, hoping nothing landed on top of us. The air outside was full of dust and pine needles, and the sky looked like it was shaking. When it finally slowed down, the forest looked different, like someone had rearranged it. Trees were down everywhere, some leaning against others, some blocking paths. It was the first time I had felt that close to losing everything on a camping trip. But that wasn't the creepiest thing I'd seen. The strangest moment came during a trip with my best friend in a semi-remote area that barely counted as a campground. You could drive there with a 4x4, but only if you knew how to handle deep ruts, loose rocks, and sudden dips. The place had 2 fire pits, a couple of rotting picnic tables, and a pair of old outhouses that looked like someone had built them decades ago, and then forgotten they existed. The parks people only checked the place once a year. It always felt empty, quiet, overlooked. We got there late in the afternoon, when the shadows stretched long across the clearing. The air smelled like sun-baked dirt mixed with the sharp scent of pine and whatever was rotting under the needles. As we unloaded our gear, I wandered around looking at how beat up everything was. The outhouses sat side by side like 2 crooked teeth. One leaned forward slightly, as if tired of holding itself together. The other had a door that didn't look like it would close properly. I walked toward them mostly out of habit. You learn early on to check outhouses before you rely on them. I opened the first door expecting to see a mess or maybe a raccoon nest inside. Instead, I froze. 3 large backpacks were sitting on the floor, propped against the back wall like someone had placed them there neatly. These weren't small bags. These were full-size, week-long trip backpacks, the kind you'd carry deep into the backcountry. All 3 were zipped, stuffed to the brim, and looked like someone had left them only minutes before. The strangeness of it hit me slowly. No one else was there. The gravel road hadn't shown a single fresh tire mark. There were no footprints in the dirt. The air felt still in that heavy way it gets when a place has been empty for a long time. We had seen no cars, no people, nothing. Yet someone had left 3 full backpacks in an outhouse like they had stepped away for a moment and forgotten the world existed. I checked the second outhouse afterward, and it was empty. Just the usual smell, the usual dark pit, the usual peeling plywood walls. We went back to the first one because curiosity is strong in places that feel forgotten. I unzipped the bags even though a part of me felt like I was crossing some line. 2 of the bags held normal camping gear. Good gear too. Quality sleeping bags, clean clothes, packed food, a stove, water filter. Everything you'd expect from someone who actually knew what they were doing. Nothing seemed damaged or used recently. but everything was packed carefully. The third bag was the one that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It was filled with Skittles. Not just a couple of bags tossed in for a snack. I mean, the entire backpack was crammed with Skittles in every form. Bulk-sized bags, small bags, share size, every flavor, every color, packed tight from the bottom to the top. When I touched the zipper, the smell of sugar drifted out as if someone had filled the whole pack at once. It was so strange, so specific, that it felt like a joke I couldn't understand. Who brings that many Skittles into the woods? Why leave them in an outhouse? Why leave 3 full packs at all? We stayed there for 4 days. No one came for them. No footsteps appeared. No car showed up. The bags sat exactly where we found them. Each night I'd glance toward the outhouse in the distance, half expecting someone to walk out of the tree line to claim their things. Nothing ever happened. The woods stayed silent except for the wind and the occasional rustle of small animals. When we finally packed up to leave, we mentioned the bags to the conservation officers when we got back to a town. They said they would check it out, but they didn't seem surprised. Strange things get abandoned in the woods all the time, they said. People panic, people leave things behind, or sometimes the people who leave things never come back. That last thought stuck with me because the bags looked like someone had stopped mid-plan, mid-trip, mid-life. The sugar bag bothered me the most. I still don't understand it. But the moment that truly shook me didn't involve strange objects or abandoned gear. It was during a simple overnight trip with my dog. It was a spur-of-the-moment thing. I parked my vehicle on one dirt road and hiked in without paying much attention to how the land curved around me. I set up a small shelter using a tarp. Nothing fancy, just enough to keep the dew off. My dog curled beside me as the sun dropped behind the hills. The fire crackled low, more for comfort than warmth. The place felt quiet in a peaceful way, like the kind of spot you find by accident and never forget. I was drifting off when I heard the rumble of a truck. It wasn't close at first, but the engine noise carried through the still air. Then it got louder, faster, like it was tearing down a rough road. I tensed because the sound wasn't coming from the direction of the road I had used. It was coming from the other side, a place I hadn't realized was as close as it was. I had misjudged the layout of the land, and the thought made me uneasy. Voices followed the engine noise, loud, scattered, drunk voices. Then the shooting started. Sharp cracks echoing through the trees, bouncing off the hills in that chaotic way gunshots do in the wilderness. My dog stiffened against me. I could feel his body shake. I felt the same inside. I knew they probably didn't know I was there, but that didn't matter. They were firing in my direction. The land sloped upward behind me, and I could hear the bullets smacking into trees somewhere on the higher ground. I imagined one shot going wild and finding its way down toward us. The thought alone was enough to make my chest tighten. I didn't wait. I packed my gear fast and quiet, grabbed the dog's leash, and moved away from the shelter. Every step felt loud even though I tried to walk as lightly as possible. The forest was pitch black, except for the faint red glow of the fire dying behind me. I didn't dare turn on my headlamp, because I didn't want any light giving away my position. I followed the sound of the creek nearby, because I knew it flowed close to the road I had come from. The cold water soaked my boots as I stepped along the bank, but I didn't stop. My dog kept close beside me, tense but trusting. The gunshots went on for a while. I could hear laughing and shouting mixed with them. None of it sounded angry. It just sounded careless, wild, the kind of noise that makes you understand how fragile your safety is in the dark. When the forest finally quieted, I was already well away from the area. I didn't relax until I saw the faint shape of my vehicle through the trees. Even then, I sat inside for a long time before starting the engine, letting the adrenaline drain out slowly. Those moments taught me that fear in the woods isn't always about animals or getting lost. Sometimes it's the wind throwing trees down around you. Sometimes it's the mystery of abandoned gear that makes no sense. Sometimes it's the unpredictable path of a bullet fired by someone who doesn't care where it lands. Each experience left a mark in its own way, and each one reminded me that the woods don't owe you safety, comfort, or answers. You walk into their space every time you go out there. You take what comes. I still camp, but I pay attention differently now. I listen longer before choosing a spot. I check where the roads run. I watch the tree lines during storms. And sometimes, when I'm alone by a fire at night, I think about those backpacks sitting in that dark little outhouse, and the sound of gunshots cutting through the quiet. I think about how close things can come to going wrong, and I remind myself that fear in the woods isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet and strange, sometimes it's sudden and violent, but it's always real, and it's always something you carry with you long after you've gone home. I still remember how dry the air felt that first night in the middle of nowhere in Arizona, how it clung to the inside of my nose every time I breathed in. We had picked that spot because it was far from everything. Far from roads, far from towns, far from the people we wanted a weekend break from. It was the kind of place where you could stand still and hear nothing but the wind scraping across sand and dry brush. I liked that at first. It made the whole place feel empty and clean. But there is a difference between being alone in the desert during the day and being alone out there at night. It changes shape when the sun goes down. It squeezes in on you. That silence stops being peaceful and starts showing a rougher edge. We set up our tents in a wide flat area tucked between low hills and dead-looking trees. The sky was open enough that even after dark you could still see shapes moving if you let your eyes adjust. I remember staring at the way our small circle of tents made this tiny island of color against the dark dirt. I kept telling myself it was just another camping trip, nothing worth thinking about. But it was impossible not to remember the stories we had heard about strange people living off-grid in places like this. Everyone jokes about that when the sun is still out. Then night falls, and the jokes stop feeling funny. When I went to sleep, I thought the worst thing I would deal with was the thin layer of dust that had already settled on my sleeping bag. The air was warm enough that I left the top of my bag loose. I fell asleep listening to the low rumble of my friends outside, the shift of feet on gravel, the crack of a small fire. I drifted in and out until everything went quiet. The kind of quiet where you almost hear your heart beat louder than anything else. I woke up because of that sound, sniffing. Slow, careful sniffing right behind my head, like something large was dragging air in and letting it out through heavy nostrils. My first thought was animal. Bear, coyote, something hungry or curious. My chest tightened before I even opened my eyes. I stayed still and let myself breathe as quietly as possible. I kept thinking that maybe someone left the cooler open, or maybe someone forgot to tie up the garbage bag, and whatever smelled it was trying to figure out where the scent was coming from. I calculated distances in my head, the location of the coolers, the amount of food we had, the bags we had left under the folding table. People always made mistakes when they were drinking or rushing to get settled. It wouldn't have surprised me. The sniffing didn't stay at my tent. That was the part that made my skin crawl. It moved away, slow and deliberate, footsteps shifting on the dirt in a way that was too soft for an animal that size. The steps were wrong. They didn't drag or hop or scuff. They pressed, lifted, the way a person would walk if they were trying not to make noise. I could feel the tension inside the tent rise as the people sleeping next to me tensed up. Even without words, I knew they were awake and hearing exactly what I was hearing. I felt a hand grip my arm tightly, another hand pressed against my leg. No one breathed loudly. No one moved. We waited. The sniffing grew faint for a second, then picked up again near the next tent. I pictured the shape of my friends sleeping there, probably curled up in their bags the same way I was. It made me wonder if they were awake, if they were scared, or if they thought it was just some animal looking for scraps. I kept trying to tell myself that too, but I knew the steps didn't match. Animals stop and lower their heads differently. They shift their weight differently. Whatever was out there had intent behind those movements. The thought settled in me, cold and slow until I could barely swallow. The attack never came. Nothing touched the tents. It was almost worse that nothing happened. It made everything stretch out far longer than it needed to. My chest ached from holding in my breath. My hands were stiff from staying still. I kept waiting for the sound to come back toward us. Instead, I heard the zipper of another tent whip open fast, like someone tearing open a bag, followed by the quick thud of feet hitting the ground. Then noise, loud noise. Someone screaming and moving and trying to scare off whatever was out there. I knew who it was before I even imagined the shape. That friend always thought noise and force were the solution to everything. I waited for the sound of running or crashing, but instead the night went flat. All I heard was heavy breathing, the rustle of footsteps, and the sharp sound of gravel scattering. It didn't take long before the truth reached us. It wasn't a bear or a coyote or anything wild. It was a man. Just a regular man out here in the middle of nowhere, looking through our coolers, touching our stuff, and leaning down to sniff the walls of our tents like he was deciding something. That part stuck with me for far longer than it should have. The idea of him choosing where to go next. The intimate strangeness of someone leaning close enough to smell the warmth of sleeping bodies through a thin sheet of fabric. We didn't stay. We didn't think about it or argue or take time to wake ourselves up properly. We packed everything with shaking hands and didn't talk about what we saw or what could have happened if the friend with the gun had slept through the sniffing. The desert looked emptier when we drove away. The sky looked harder. I remember watching the spot where we had been get swallowed by darkness in the side mirror, until there was nothing left but headlights bouncing off dry scrub. You would think that experience would have been enough to make us stay far away from that part of Arizona. But a year later we were back near the same area, thinking we were smarter than before. People talk themselves into false safety fast when distance is involved. The desert can change so much in a year that you start believing whatever happened before was just a strange one-time event. We parked our trucks differently that year. Instead of tents, we climbed into the backs of trucks and SUVs and tried to convince ourselves that elevation and metal sides were enough to keep weird things away. I know how stupid it sounds now, but at the time it felt like a plan. I fell asleep in the back of my SUV with my girlfriend next to me. It was hot inside, even with all the windows cracked open. The air felt trapped, stale, unmoving, but it was better than sleeping stretched out on the dry ground. I closed my eyes thinking the worst thing I would deal with was waking up stiff or sweaty. I drifted into a heavy sleep, too tired to care how uncomfortable everything felt. The bright light on my face dragged me out of sleep so fast that my throat tightened. It wasn't the soft glow of dawn or the flicker of a dying fire. It was a direct beam pointed straight at me. I didn't move. My instincts kicked in faster than my thoughts. I sensed something wrong before I even processed it. I pretended to be asleep and kept my breathing slow and deep. I hoped my girlfriend beside me would do the same. I felt her body stiffen just slightly, but she didn't move either. I stared at the inside of my eyelids and waited. The light hovered. I could hear faint footsteps near the gravel outside the vehicle. No voice, no sound of recognition, just slow movement, and the beam sliding across the glass like someone was studying the inside carefully. I kept listening for sniffing, because the memory from the year before refused to leave my head. All I heard instead was breathing that wasn't mine. Steady, calculated, strangely calm. The kind of breathing that suggested the person outside wasn't scared or panicked at all. He was simply observing. The light moved away from my SUV and I opened my eyes just enough to see a shape walking toward the next truck. I watched the beam slide over my friends, traced across their bodies the same way it had traced over mine. The shape belonged to an older man. His posture was relaxed, like he was out for a casual walk. He stood there for a long moment, looking into each truck bed, studying faces, studying bodies, studying whatever he wanted to see. That part made something sink inside me. He looked at us with the kind of calm interest that didn't belong out here at night. When he finally walked away from our campsite, I felt something in me unlock. I pushed the back door of my SUV open and jumped out so fast my legs almost gave out. I shook everyone awake, moving from truck to truck, and every person I reached had the same look in their eyes. They had been awake too. They had been pretending to sleep the same way I had. They all knew what happened. We didn't argue or pack slowly. We knew better this time. We left the campsite so fast we didn't bother with the careful cleanup we normally did. The fire pit still held the last of the glowing embers when we drove off. The headlights cut through the desert in huge shaky arcs as we sped away. Even as we left, even as the sight disappeared into the darkness behind us, I kept imagining the man standing in the same spot we had just vacated, watching the lights fade, waiting for the desert to swallow them. The ending of all of this still feels simple and heavy at the same time. We learned exactly what we needed to learn, even if it took 2 tries to make us understand it. The danger out there wasn't the desert, or the heat, or the animals. It was people. Regular people who didn't follow the same rules we assumed everyone followed. People who wandered campsites at night, sniffed tents, stared into trucks, and examined strangers in their sleep without hesitation or guilt. The desert didn't protect us from them. It hid them. We never went back to that area again. There was nothing left for us to figure out or confront. We weren't trying to be brave anymore. We understood that sometimes the smartest thing you can do is leave a place behind for good. The desert stayed the same, wide and empty, but we weren't the same people who had arrived there thinking it was all just another camping weekend. We drove home with the windows closed, the heat trapped inside the cars, and no one laughed or pretended it wasn't serious. The quiet ride back felt like the real warning, the real lesson. I still camp sometimes, but not out there. Not in that part of Arizona. The memory of those nights stays sharp, detailed, and heavy, like something pressed into the center of my mind. Every time I close a tent zipper or turn off a flashlight, I think about the sound of slow sniffing against thin fabric. I think about the beam of a flashlight moving across my face while I pretended to sleep. I think about how easily things could have gone wrong, and I know without any doubt that some places are empty for a reason.